In the last video, we talked about metaphysics, being, and how being is said of its various modes analogically. In this video, we need to deal with the fact that things of our experience are not static, but change, and become what they are not. Put another way, in our study of reality, we not only have to give an account of the real being of things, but an account of how something can become what it is not already. That is, how it can change. And I'm not talking about simply how our mental conception of something might change, which is itself a change of a sort, but how the thing itself as extra mental being can really change. This topic is often profitably explored by considering arguments against the possibility of change from Eleatics, a group of pre-Socratic philosophers. But let me make a few comments about non-being before I do that. As I was saying in the previous video, outside of being is simply non-being, or nothing. Now, we have to be clear about what this means. This so-called nothing isn't a so-called state of nothing, since even a state has being, and there are no states to speak of when we're talking about nothing. There's simply nothing to talk about. Anything you're trying to attribute to nothing simply isn't there. There are no powers of nothing, or abilities of nothing, or qualities of nothing, or features of nothing, or properties of nothing, or possibilities of nothing, or anything of this sort. This is very important to emphasize because many do not realize the radicality of non-being, and will proceed to talk about non-being as if it has abilities to produce things, or to be a so-called state, as if it were a sort of being, but black and empty, as if nothing were a sort of blank background space, in which there just happen to be no objects. Given that non-being does not have powers, capacities, potentialities, it should be quite clear how manifestly absurd it is to claim that something can come from nothing. To say that something can come from nothing is to say that nothing can produce something, or that some being can be drawn out of nothing. But again, nothing has no abilities, or capacities, or powers of any sort, including productive ones, since these all have being in some way. Therefore, such an entertaining of the notion that something can come from nothing is just preposterous nonsense, no matter the qualifications, or social status, or authority the individual claims to represent, even if he's a physicist or some other scientist. The man who says something can come from nothing is simply talking nonsense. Also, there's no such thing as so-called approximately nothing, or a so-called first approximation of nothing either. To approximate is when two beings almost come into contact and approach one another in some way. But nothing isn't anything that can be approached or gotten next to. For so long as anything has being, it is not nothing. The principle from nothing, nothing comes, or ex nihilo nihil fit, is not an arbitrary stipulation that's subject to revision or some hypothesis, but something we know with certainty from our acquaintance with real being. But here we have a problem when we consider what change entails. Change entails that something which is not yet become actual. But how in the world can this happen? Since it's a real change, the ending term of the change cannot be already actual. The acorn that will become an oak isn't actually and already an oak, since if it were, there would be no change to speak of, since an oak to an oak isn't a change. But if it's not actual, and since actuality is, for all we know at this point, just the very same as being, the only other possibility is that that which is not yet came from nothing, since for all we know at this point, there is only actual being, or actuality, and non-being, or nothing. That is to say, the oak comes from nothing, or is educed from nothing. We said before that from nothing, nothing comes, so this being not yet cannot come from nothing, which would be preposterous nonsense. We are therefore forced to conclude here that change isn't real. That is, an acorn cannot really become an oak, because if it were to become an oak, then the oak would be educed from nothing, and nothing can be educed from nothing. Now, it gets even worse than this, because the senses indicate that change really happens. The pot of water on the stove really becomes hot when placed on the burner. The hot cup of coffee grows cold, an acorn becomes an oak tree, a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Therefore, since the senses indicate the reality of change, they cannot be reliable, since if they were reliable, change would be real, and the argument has just concluded that change isn't real, so the senses are not reliable. But how then are we supposed to get knowledge of the world? Well, supposing we can get it, it cannot be founded on the senses, or even on phenomena, which also indicate change, since those are apparently unreliable. So it must be based on something that's not sensorial. Perhaps this would be something like pure thought, or some sort of contemplation of form, or something as static as ideas are when considered in their universality. For example, the idea of triangularity, when considered in its universality, is static and does not change, utterly unlike what we sense. All drawn triangles are going to change, such as one drawn in chalk or in ink, or the face of a pyramid, however slight, And the triangles we actually see are going to be imperfect in some way, but triangularity considered apart and removed from the instances, that is, abstracted, will never change, and will be perfect as far as triangles go. So what are we to make of all this? Let's begin with that argument against the reality of change. Can anyone really accept this argument as sound? Well, no, because supposing you were convinced by the argument, you'd now believe that change isn't real, when you had initially believed it was, or perhaps uncertain about it. Now, believing that change is real is not the same as believing that change is not real. So this would also be a change, specifically a mental one. To accept the argument presupposes that change is real. Furthermore, to even consider the argument qua argument requires examining the steps in the argument, those propositions within, and drawing out the conclusion from the premises. This too requires a change, even mentally, just to consider one premise after the next, and to make judgments about their truth or falsity. And clearly the premises aren't all the same, so that one is required to mentally move through premises which aren't the same. Furthermore, just considering the sensory experience, or the so-called phenomena, if you will, indicates a change, since you just heard me say one premise, then another, and then the conclusion. These aren't all the same things you just heard, so even the phenomena just considered as the way it seems, even audibly or visually by inspecting the argument, presupposes the reality of change. This is in addition to real change being necessary for there to be sensation at all, since sensation at least minimally requires undergoing a change of some sort to pick up something new and to detect reality. You can reflect on how this has to be the case with each sense modality, but it is especially true in the case of tactile sensation, such as when one reaches out and touches something, such as a warm cup of coffee sitting on your table, and that one can sense not only there's something there when reaching out and grabbing it, but also its warmth, its texture, and many other features of it. This is all impossible to do if change isn't real. It's therefore clear that something is very wrong with this argument, but we haven't yet identified where it is going wrong. That is, identify the false supposition, or the faulty inference, or possibly both, which is what we actually require to address the argument. And this especially goes for moderns, who might just snort at this and say it's a frivolous argument, or have a sort of credulity that so-called science takes care of it, or scientists know how to answer it and therefore I don't need to worry about it. Or one might just say this has no bearing on reality. But none of the above sentiments is appropriate for one actually interested in the truth. In point of fact, to deny change is manifestly contrary to reason, since if it were reasonable, one would have to proceed through an argument or mental deliberation to some extent, even if it weren't explicitly written out line by line, and then decide to reject the reality of change based on the deliberation. But to mentally deliberate and accept a conclusion are not the same, since the deliberation is not yet having accepted the conclusion and still considering it as to its truth, whereas concluding means really having accepted it, at least by supposition. Therefore, it's manifestly contrary to reason to deny the reality of change. This goes for all the philosophers who have some argument that concludes that change is not real because of some premise allegedly drawn from modern physics, and insofar as they try to give arguments, all of which are going to be some sort of step-by-step deliberation from premises to conclusion. Again, to draw the conclusion presupposes having considered the premises and the evidence in question, then drawing the conclusion that change isn't real. Furthermore, to actually reason in this way presupposes that one and the same person is deliberating and drawing the conclusion, which requires a change, and not two different people, since if it's not the same person, the person cannot be said to be reasoning from premises to conclusion or reasoning at all. If it were not the same person, this would be no more reasoning than if three separate individuals sequentially had the thoughts, first, all A's are B's, then two, all B's are C's, and finally, all A's are C's. This all presupposes the reality of change, even if purely in the mind, just to rationally draw the conclusion that change isn't real. And this applies across the board to all proposals and arguments against the reality of change, no matter what authority they purport to draw from science. One could deny what I've been saying, and say to deliberate is just the same as to conclude, and that all the premises of the argument are really the same, or that all the phenomena are really the same, when they clearly aren't. But to respond to that, we're going to have to use the Avicenna method to demonstrate the law of non-contradiction to the gentleman. That deliberating is not the same as concluding, which is no longer deliberating. And while we're at it, that being beaten is not the same as not being beaten, and that being burned is not the same as not being burned. So where does the argument go wrong? We still need to actually make sense of change, and the argument seems to force us into the absurdity of either denying the reality of change, or saying that something can be educed from nothing. Let's return to that step in the argument where we noted that because we're supposing the reality of change, that which is not yet must be not actual, we then inferred from that non-actuality simply entails non-being. But this second inference, that non-actuality entails non-being, is false. Its falsity entails that there must be that which is neither actuality nor non-being, because if there is not, then we're either stuck with denying the reality of change or saying that being can be produced from non-being or absolute nothingness, both of which are preposterous. That which is neither actuality nor nothing is called potency, or potential being. Therefore, the problem of change is solved by saying that which is not yet actual is both not actual, which allows for the possibility of change, since it's not yet the final term of the change, but also not nothing, which safeguards us from having to conclude that something can come from nothing, which would be absurd. And that which is not yet still has being, just not actuality, or actual being. It is but in potency, or potentially. This is the basis for the division of being into actuality, or actual being, and potentiality, or potential being, also called the Act-Potency distinction. Now, at this point, one must track the meanings of these words, actuality, act, action, active, very carefully, because the sloppy use of these words without remembering what they mean leads to confusion. Furthermore, we can now see how we can understand change in a broad and abstract sense as the actualization of a potential. What is potential in something is brought to actuality, not from nothing, but educed from potential being. As you can see, the act-potency distinction is deduced and not some arbitrary stipulation or hypothesis. To believe it false lands one right in incoherence by denying the reality of change, or maintaining the absurdity that nothing can produce things. There are really three options how one proceeds from this point in one's philosophical work on this foundational issue of understanding change, which is required to understand reality. If change is real, then either one accepts the reality of change, and either accepts the act-potency distinction, or starts saying that nothing can produce things, or on the other hand, say that change isn't real, which as we've seen is simply incoherent anyway. So I would say that if your metaphysics has option 2 or 3 within it, then you've already fundamentally and radically gone wrong in your thought, and your errors will become magnified as you draw conclusions. As Aristotle says, a small mistake in the beginning is a great one in the end. With this act-potency distinction in hand, we can now establish a general principle concerning the being of things, just by exhausting the possibilities of actuality and potentiality. For anything that is, it must either be purely potential, a mixture or composite of potentiality and actuality, or it must be purely actual. These are the only three possibilities, and there is no fourth. However, anything that actually is must have some sort of actuality to whatever degree, and actually be in some way. And so this excludes the possibility of pure potency, since pure potency isn't yet actual in any respect. Therefore, we exclude that option and narrow the possibilities down to two, those being pure actuality, or a mixture or composite of actuality and potentiality. This establishes a general principle of being, that potency and act divide being in such a way so that whatever is either pure act, or of necessity is composed of potency and act. You can see that this is just a deduction drawn from the real distinction between act and potency. Now, this doesn't yet prove that there is something that is purely actual, or pure act. But it certainly raises the question in an obvious way, and the question does demand an answer. At this point, there are only two broad possibilities when considering reality as a whole. Given the reality of change, there are at least some things that are composed of act and potency, since potency is required for things to really change. Now, either there is something which is pure act, or there is not. If there is nothing which is pure act, this would mean that absolutely everything is a composite of act and potency. That right there gives the two possibilities in terms of the big picture. Either 1, there is that which is pure act and changeable reality of things composed of act and potency, or 2, absolutely everything is composed of act and potency. There's no third option when it comes to real being, and I don't know isn't one of these options when it comes to the being of things. That's just an irrelevant comment based on one's uncertainty and subjective state, not extramental reality. One of the two is correct, and they obviously cannot both be right. That there is pure actuality is established through metaphysical demonstration based on the act-potency distinction, and I'd like to cover this directly in either the next video or the one after that, just because people are interested in topics like St. Thomas's first way, and other arguments reasoning from the change we observe in the world to God. But we can see that there is that which is purely actual indirectly from conclusions we've already established earlier on in the series. Recall in Part 2, we established through the argument from the distinction between essence and existence that there must be that in which essence is just the same as existence, or that which is just subsistent existence itself. If there were not, then nothing in which essence is distinct from existence could exist even for a moment, because as we saw in that argument, such things need to be caused to exist, and this conservation of existence is ultimately due to subsistent existence itself, and nothing less could be responsible in a universal sense for the existence of things in which essence is really distinct from existence. It is rather easy to see how, if there is something which just is its own existence, or subsistent existence itself, then such a thing must also be pure actuality. Recall that essence is to existence as potency is to act. That is, essence is a sort of potentiality which, considered on its own, doesn't yet exist, but must be made to exist, or actualized, to have a real existence with that essence. That is, the essence of a man, on its own, doesn't yet give you an actual man. For that, the essence must be actualized, or an act of existence must be added to the essence or conjoined to it to give you an actual man. The same goes for anything in which essence is really distinct from existence, in that an act of existence must be added to actualize this essence. But now, something in which essence just is the same as existence doesn't require any such addition. And what it is, its essence, is existence itself, or actual being, or actuality, simply put. Anything less than purely actual being here could not be said to be existence itself, simply put, rather actual being composed with some potential being. Therefore, that which just is its existence must also just be actuality itself, or pure actuality. What it is simply actuality, and just is its own act of existence, as opposed to it being required to be conjoined to it from without. Another way we can obtain this conclusion is through the simplicity of subsistent existence itself. We know that in anything less than pure actuality, that is, a composite of act and potency, it cannot be said to be absolutely simple being, since it is a composite of act and potency. On the other hand, that in which essence is the same as existence must be absolutely simple being, since if it were not, it wouldn't be existence itself, rather subsistent existence itself, entering into a composition with another, in which case it's not subsistent, since it requires some composition of distinct parts in order to exist. Put another way, such a composition would require a cause responsible for the conjoining of distinct parts in just the right way in order for this thing to exist, whereas that which just is its own existence is absolutely devoid of such causes of its existence. That is, it's uncaused in its being. Therefore, we must conclude that if there is something which is just subsistent existence itself, it cannot be a composite of act and potency, and so must be purely actual. And that there is that which is subsistent existence itself was established in the argument from Part 2 in the series. Therefore, we must conclude from what we've already demonstrated that the correct big picture implied by the division of being by act and potency is the one in which there is that which is pure act, and all other beings besides it are composites of act and potency. We've seen that whatever just is subsistent existence itself must also be pure actuality. The converse is also true, that whatever is pure actuality must also exist in a subsistent way. This is true because to say that something is pure act is also to say that it exists in a purely actual way, and therefore does not need to be caused in order to exist, say by the concurrent actualization of a potentiality. But anything in which essence is distinct from existence must be caused to exist by another. Put another way, anything which falls short of being the very same as its existence, that is, subsistent existence itself, must be caused in its existence, or caused to be. We conclude from this that if something exists in a purely actual way, then essence must be just the same as existence, because again, if essence were not just the same as existence, then it must be caused to exist. But pure actuality doesn't need to be caused to exist. Therefore, we conclude from the above discussion that something is purely actual if and only if its essence is just the same as its existence, which means we're talking about the very same reality when we speak of either subsistent existence itself or pure actuality. The only difference is that the former uses the language of essence and existence, whereas the latter uses the language of actuality and potentiality. This also means that whatever is proved of subsistent existence itself is proved of pure actuality, and the converse, for they are the very same reality. For instance, the unicity of pure actuality can also be seen through the unicity of subsistent existence itself, for there cannot be many subsistent existences itself. For it to be many requires that one have something that the other does not, namely that one is subsistent existence itself plus something else. But this violates the very assumption that it is subsistent existence itself. Therefore, they cannot be many subsistent existences itself. Therefore, subsistent existence itself is one, which means that pure actuality is one. Now, before I devote at least a video to such arguments from change which reason to pure actuality directly, as opposed to what I was just doing and going through the essence-existence distinction, we have the tools needed to establish key premises in those arguments, just by what we've talked about with regards to act-Potency. For instance, we've seen that we are able to understand change as the actualization of a potential. That is, what was once potential in being is now drawn or educed to actual being in a change. For example, we are to understand the acorn as becoming an oak in the sense that the potential oak is educed from the acorn, as opposed to coming from nothing. That is, the acorn might be actually an acorn currently, but is an oak in potency, which will eventually be drawn out as it becomes an oak. Now the question is, how can what is merely potential in a being, such as the oak and the acorn, be drawn out or educed from the acorn if the oak is merely in potency? How does the actual oak get drawn out or educed from the acorn? What is required for such change at the levels of metaphysics and philosophy of nature? So what is responsible for the actualization of this potential? The potential oak cannot be responsible, since it is just in potency and is not yet. And there's no actual oak in that which is potentially an oak, since something cannot be both in act and in potency in the same way, since it would have to be and not be. Therefore, something else other than the potential oak must be responsible for the actualization of this potency and the being of the oak. And this something else cannot be just another potency, since potency on its own can't do anything yet, since it doesn't yet exist, merely being in potency. The conclusion is that the actualization of a potential must be due to or caused by another actuality. This implies the impossibility of something being both actualized and actualizing in the very same respect, for such a situation entails something being both actually and potentially in the very same way, which is strictly speaking impossible. This principle of causality can be formulated in many different ways, all getting at the same truth. The actualization of potential is due to another actuality, or whatever goes from potency to act is actualized by another, or whatever is changed by another. Now, when we're talking about scholastic philosophy, this is just what is meant by the principle that whatever is moved by another, since what people like St. Thomas mean by motion is the actualization of a potential, which is clear if you read their texts. And this principle is just the same as what we said above, that the actualization of a potential must be due to another actuality. Since change doesn't just include locomotion, whatever is changed by another. As you can hopefully see, none of this is an arbitrary stipulation or a so-called hypothesis. It's a strict deduction from the principles of act-Potency and grounds the intelligibility of change as such, and was responsible for change when a new actuality is educed from something which was previously in potency only. Please notice what I did not say. I didn't say that everything is in motion, or that everything is changing, or that everything has a cause. No one here is arguing that everything is in motion, or that everything is changing, or that everything has a cause. And if someone claims the argument from change claims such things, he doesn't even know what the premises of the argument are. I have to point this out again and again, because as we saw in part 1, there is a pervasive misunderstanding of these arguments. What we're doing is deducing what's required for there to be actualization of a potential, which is something we're sure happens due to our experience of change in the world. The principles of act-Potency apply to all being whatsoever, and so it is impossible that anything should be found to contradict the principle that whatever is changed by another, or that what goes from potency to act is due to another actuality, or is actualized by another, even if it's true that one may not know or even be able to mentally grasp the actuality responsible for the actualization. Such a proposed scenario would not just be mysterious and difficult to grasp, but unintelligible, and so the person claiming such a thing is just talking nonsense. This is just as impossible as it is for a right triangle in Euclidean space to be found to contradict the Pythagorean theorem. This, being a straight deduction from the principles of act-Potency, is much more certain than any speculations about this or that poorly understood phenomenon in modern physics. And physics must follow first principles if it is to be a science and intelligible. Such a scenario in which one proposes that an actualization of a potential just somehow happens without a cause is especially preposterous for Aristotelians because the effect, namely the reduction of potency to act, is utterly unintelligible as an effect, qua effect, because the effect is just what the cause does, and so it is utterly unintelligible to have some effect here without a cause. And therefore it's preposterous to have a reduction of potency to act, the effect, without cause or actualization by another. In other words, to remove a cause is to remove its effect. The cause and effect are just aspects of the very same event under question, not two distinct events which can be uncoupled. And so if there is no cause, there is no effect to speak of. So when thinking about first principles, the truth of the principle of causality, that whatever is changed by another, or whatever is reduced from potency to act is actualized by another, or what goes from potency to act has a cause, or whatever formulation we're using, are on very secure ground, since their denial is just nonsensical, which is also to say that the premises of such arguments reasoning from the reality of change to pure actuality are on secure ground. Now, it should also be said as a final comment that in light of the analogy of being we covered in the previous videos, that although both act and potency are not non-being, and therefore have being to some degree, being is not said of actuality and potentiality in the same exact way, that is, univocally. If that were true, then actuality would not really be distinct from potentiality. But actuality is really distinct from potentiality. Otherwise, if that were true, that would land you at the same problems we covered above concerning the reality of change. Therefore, actuality and potentiality do not have being in the exact same way. Both are real principles of reality, and both are required to understand change, and so this isn't fanciful speech or equivocation. Again, we see that being is said in many ways, and that its use must be understood analogically, though there is a sense in which being is said primarily of actuality, and that potentiality is always potentiality for some actuality or perfection, and cannot be understood as such without the correlated actuality, which grounds this potentiality. So, when considering a change, it might be the case that potentiality is prior to actuality in the order of actualization, in that act is deduced from potency, but absolutely speaking, actuality is prior to potentiality in the order of perfection, because actuality grounds the intelligibility of potentiality and cannot be understood without it. Yet another reason why we must draw the conclusion that there is that which is purely actual.
We